You are listening to Slaughter in Shangri-la, the Invasion of Tibet. This is an audio program for War Stories with Mark Felton. At 1:45 p.m. on the 5th of July 1904, Brigadier General MacDonald opened brisk rifle fire on the Gyantse-dzong. At 3:30 p.m., 2 guns, 6 companies of infantry, and 1 mounted infantry company were sent to make a feint on the northern side of the dzong. This succeeded in getting the Tibetans to reinforce that side. After dark, the British column was quietly withdrawn. Just after midnight, 12 guns, 12 infantry companies, and 1 of mounted infantry with a half company of sappers moved out into 2 columns to a position southeast of the dzong. The attack commenced with the whole dzong lighting up with the flashes of rifle and jingle fire, and down below our own fire getting hotter and hotter, so recalled Major Younghusband. The British forces reorganized with Colonel Campbell and the 40th Pathans on the right, and Major Murray and the 8th Gurkhas on the left. The Royal Fusiliers supported. Captain Shepherd succeeded in getting a charge under the walls of the strongest held house in the fortress, opening a breach. On his left, Lieutenants Gurdon and Burney also blew breaches in houses, Gurdon being killed in the process. At 3 p.m., MacDonald ordered 4 companies in reserve and the 10-pounder guns to commence firing on the portion of the wall to be breached for the main assault. Bit by bit, the Great Wall tumbled under a storm of shells until by 4 p.m. a big enough opening had been created. Rapid firing was ordered, and the infantry and Maxim guns showered the fortress's upper floors with fire to cover the assault force as it slowly climbed up to the breach. Very, very gradually, the Gurkhas, under Lieutenant John Grant, made their upward way. First a few arrived just under the breach, then more and more. Supported by the Royal Fusiliers, the Gurkhas soon found themselves in a bottleneck before the breach and under intense enemy rifle fire. Grant and Havildar Kabir Pun broke through alone, and despite being wounded, the 2 men carried the attack into the dzong. Grant was later awarded the Victoria Cross, and Pun the Indian Order of Merit First Class, a glowing citation appearing in the London Gazette. Quote, "On emerging from the cover of the village, they had to advance up a bare, almost precipitous rock face, with little or no cover and under heavy fire. Showers of rocks and stones were at the time being hurled down the hillside by the enemy. Lieutenant Grant, followed by Havildar Kabir Pun, at once attempted to scale it, but on reaching the top he was wounded and hurled back, as was the Havildar, who fell down the rock some 30 feet. Regardless of their injuries, they again attempted to scale the breach, and covered by the fire of men below them were successful, the Havildar shooting 1 Tibetan on gaining the top." Unquote. The Gurkhas and Royal Fusiliers charged through the breach, fighting tier to tier until the Union Jack was at last unfurled atop the fort's highest pinnacle. On the 14th of July, the British began their advance on Lhasa unopposed, the capture of Gyantse-dzong appearing to have destroyed Tibetan morale to resist. Once again, Younghusband sent letters ahead to both the Dalai Lama and the Chinese Amban asking for negotiations. But just when it seemed that Tibetan resolve to stop the British had cracked, a fresh block on the expedition was imposed at Kerala Pass, where the British had already fought. The wall across the 16,600-foot pass had been repaired and extended, buttressing against the surrounding mountains that reached up to 24,000 feet high and were topped with snow. Behind the wall, the Tibetans had constructed a line of rock sangars. About 1,500 Tibetans garrisoned the position. At 7 a.m. on the 18th of July 1904, the attack began when the Royal Fusiliers attacked in the centre, and the 8th Gurkhas and 40th Pathans sent parties out onto each flank. The artillery had a field day, firing from several hundred feet above the Tibetan position, the high altitude making the shells travel faster and longer. The Gurkhas and Pathans struggled up to 18,000 feet, turned the Tibetan flanks, and then the artillery pursued the fleeing enemy with shrapnel shells. Following the breaching of the Shangri-la Pass position, the first signs that the Tibetans wished to negotiate reached Major Younghusband. A deputation of high lamas from Lhasa met Younghusband at Nagatse, a few miles on from the Shangri-la Pass. The war-fighting phase was now well and truly over, after one of the most extraordinary campaigns in British military history, fought on the roof of the world. Younghusband now assumed command from General MacDonald, who, with the exception of 2,000 troops, marched back to Sikkim. Younghusband reached Lhasa on the 4th of August 1904, only to discover that the Potala Palace was empty. The 13th Dalai Lama had fled to Outer Mongolia, fearing British retribution. The Chinese Amban's troops escorted Younghusband into the city, where he spent some weeks intimidating the regent, Gandon Tri Rinpoche, and an ad hoc Tibetan government into signing the so-called Anglo-Tibetan Agreement. Younghusband's self-drafted agreement allowed for Anglo-Tibetan trade at Yardong, Gyaltsen, and Gartok, and forced the Tibetans to pay an indemnity of £500,000, later reduced. The Chumbi Valley would be ceded to Britain until the indemnity was paid and the Tibet-Sikkim border recognized. Tibet was forced to promise that it would have no relations with any other foreign power, making Tibet a British protectorate. Naturally, the Chinese immediately rejected this last part of the treaty, and Britain actually backed down, formally accepting Chinese claims over Tibet. Acting Viceroy Lord Amtil later reduced the indemnity by 2/3, and a revised agreement, the Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1906, agreed to recognize China's rights over Tibet in return for a sizable bribe from the Qing court. Britain also agreed not to annex Tibetan territory or to interfere in the administration of Tibet by China. The British returned to India and peace returned to Tibet, but that nation's status continued to provide conflict and diplomatic uncertainty for generations to come. In 1910, the dying Qing dynasty in Beijing made one last attempt to re-establish its authority over Tibet when it sent General Zhao Erfeng and an army to depose the Dalai Lama and introduce direct rule from Peking. The Dalai Lama fled south, this time to British India. Zhao was deeply unpopular with the Tibetans, who resented his harsh policies and his disrespecting of local culture. 2 years later, the Qing dynasty was finished. Imperial troops were escorted from Tibet, and in 1914 Tibet signed the Shimla Accord with Britain and ceded a region known as South Tibet to India, the Chinese denouncing this agreement as illegal. Francis Younghusband was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Indian Empire in 1904. He was British Commissioner in Kashmir in 1906 and promoted to Lieutenant Colonel 2 years later. In 1917 he was honoured again, this time being appointed a Knight Commander of the Order of the Star of India, made President of the Royal Geographical Society in 1919, and was Chairman of the Mount Everest Committee, encouraging George Mallory and others in their attempts to climb the highest mountain in the world. He died of a stroke in Dorset in July 1942. Tibet remains as important in international relations today as when Francis Younghusband led his march to Lhasa in 1904, and perhaps as mysterious. You have been listening to Slaughter in Shangri-La, The Invasion of Tibet, researched and written by Dr. Mark Felton. For a wide variety of videos on many historical subjects, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.